And notice too, although Spengler doesn't go into this, that the Greeks conceived of the citizen, this idea for the first time in history of the citizen, in contrast to the ancient world, the rest of the Orient and the ancient world of the Middle East, where the idea was that the citizen of a city-state was a subject to a king, a subject to a despot who was either the incarnation of a god or was divinely appointed to rule. So that the citizen, in some ways, not really a citizen, but a subject to a cosmic power that receives its mandate from the stars, from the heavens normally. And the king, the despot, the Oriental despot, is the incarnation of this juridical order that's written in the structure, the very structure of the cosmos, what the Chinese call Li. In their case, the ruler, his reign was justified by the so-called mandate of heaven. And if he was overthrown, let's say, as the rulers of the of the Shang dynasty were overthrown by the Zhou dynasty, that is because he lost, those previous rulers lost the justification of the mandate of heaven, and the mandate was then transferred to the new ruler of the Zhou dynasty. This is the old idea of an impersonal macrocosmic order that the Greeks junked with their idea that the citizen, with the creation of the citizen as a self-responsible citizen of a city-state who rationally governs himself and his own actions. So it's a very different idea than the older idea of the citizen of the theologically inspired cosmic polyspheric model. And Bachofen, J.J. Bachofen, who in the 19th century had written Das Mutterrecht, the book about mother right, where he traced the descent of Bachofen was by training a jurist, so he knew about the law, and he had identified the law of the matriarchy, whose residue he found in his study of the classical myths as basically the law of lex talionis, which is the law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as the Jews inherited it. And it's cyclical, it's mythical law. It's like it's consistent with Gebser's mythical consciousness structure, which is based on the mythical cosmos of ever-recurring cycles of time. The lex talionis then perpetuates the cycle. The Furies in Aeschylus want retribution for Orestes committing the sin of matricide. They want that, they need that retribution because it's part of this cyclical structure of the cosmos, this residua that the Greeks are trying to shed by working it out through their tragedies, just as we Faustians in our Grail romances were trying to shed the Magian Levantine influence of the group idea, the consensus, the community. So it's a very different sense of law, and Bachofen says that the Romans then introduced the rational sense of law as something that is rational and is governed by the individual by himself in accordance with Roman law, which is to say the jus civili. So then Spengler moves on to what the essence of the Magian law is, and he says that what corresponds in the Magian law applies to the incorporeal person, not the persona, not to the actual physical body that had applied with its character as persona to the Greeks as a body among bodies, the totality of the bodies in the Greek idea comprising the soma, the body of the city-state. But instead, with the Magians, we get the idea that the law applies to the incorporeal person, but the incorporeal person is a collective body, because with the Magian world, we get this idea of a consensus. The consensus community model corresponds in the Magian world to the city-state, which is geographically rooted, and the laws apply within that only insofar as the individual is covered and protected by the laws of that particular polis, that particular polisphere. Within the Magian world, though, the laws are of the consensus community in which the pneuma, the spirit, comes down, descends down, and unites and bonds the community with an invisible metaphysical glue, such that its utterances are metaphysically certain because they come from the spirit, not from the individual personality. And so law, as it's first worked out it starts in the Syrian law book, he says, is worked out as being binding for the ijma in the Arabian world. This is called the ijma, the community, as a world in which the individual is part of this community, and the community has no kind of geographical location whatsoever. In the Magian world, The law binds the individual insofar as he's a member of this community, and so notice that it is inherently diasporic. It's a diasporic model. And as the result of that, I think in today's society, and the internet favors a diasporic world. The internet is a kind of diasporic technology. That is to say, it emphasizes not where you're at geographically on the planet, but your community, your group, the identifier, the semiotic that you have that identifies you as part of a group, which can be globally dispersive. And so this is Arjun Appadurai's idea of the diasporic public sphere. And because the Magian societies are based on these non-local, non-geographically specific consensus communities, each with its own book, its own type of writing, its own script, its own belief system, because they are diasporic, the modern global society favors these kinds of communities, and so they tend to do very well within them. Whereas, insofar as the classical legacy of the individual being covered by the law only insofar as he is sheltered by a city-state becomes, in the Western world, covers the individual insofar as he's sheltered by a nation-state. But notice that, as with Giorgio Agamben's idea of the homo sacer, today those individuals who now find themselves outside of a polosphere or outside of a nation-state and who are no longer recognized by any particular nation-state has the juridical order withdrawn from him and finds himself in the camp situation, the refugee camp or the concentration camp situation, in which he is now homo sacer. And in the classical world, the homo sacer was that individual who wasn't covered by the laws of the polis, who existed outside them, even if he was inside, physically, the polosphere. If he wasn't covered by them because he wasn't a citizen, then he could be killed with impunity. Anything could happen to him. And so those individuals today, in like manner, who find themselves outside of the political order of the juridical polosphere are in a very precarious situation, and anything can be done to them with impunity, with no consequences. And so note that, as Spengler points out then in this book, he says that those individuals who, in the ancient world, this is why citizenship by the Gauls and the Germans and the barbarians was so coveted, because once you attained citizenship, you got all these privileges. You were covered by the law. But he says that this corresponds then in the Magian world to sacraments, the sacrament of baptism, for instance. Once you receive it, the pneuma pours down into you. You are now part of a spiritual community. And so the laws change. In the old world, he says that what mattered was where you were at and what city-state you were a citizen of. Let's say, he says, a Roman burgher could not marry a Capuan princess or a Capuan woman if there was not some kind of legal connubium between these two city-states. The marriage was illegal. However, by the time we get to the age of Constantine, in the 4th century AD, when he universalizes Christianity, and the Roman Empire is only so in name, by this point it's a Magian world with a central emperor who's the incarnation of a divinely appointed rule. In that world, what mattered was, it didn't matter where you were at geographically anymore, it mattered what your faith was, what your belief was. So he says that even a man, let's say, who was of Irish descent living in a Syrian city, if he was a Nestorian, he could not marry another woman living in the same city who was a Monophysite, if there wasn't some kind of connubium between these different faiths. So they could actually live in the same city, and their marriage would be illegal. And you can see this is a carryover from the old Jewish idea that you can see in the Old Testament with the law code of Ezra that he puts in place after the Jews come back from Babylon and begin to rebuild the state, and he puts the injunction in that every Jew who is married to a foreigner, all those marriages need to be dissolved. It's an emphasis on racial purity and on the maintenance of the bloodline, but on the consensus, the idea that you're bound as part of a community, and the laws apply to you within that community, but they don't apply to the other community. And so he says that in the law books, the text has a particular magical revelatory significance for the Magian consciousness. And so law, as it's articulated in the Talmud by the Jews, or as it's articulated by the Mullah, or the Olima, or the Qadi, has a magical substance to it, and the law book that is consulted by the Magian almost becomes an oracular utterance. And it doesn't make any difference whether it applied to a previous case or whether it even applies to this case. What matters is that the Spirit speaks out of the script, and even the letters are carefully studied for any kind of magical revelation. Think of the Hebrew letters. The entire religion of the Jewish Kabbalah is based on studying all the little magical components of the Hebrew letters. Even those can have magical revelatory aspects to them that have a bearing on the political, juridical, the actual juridical case that is now before the judge, the Qadi or the Mullah or the Ulema, whoever it happens to be. So the magical text is to the office of the Qadi what the praetor's lifetime experience in his office, holding his political office and testing his judgments on a case-by-case basis was to that society. Two very different conceptions of the law. And so he's going to say that one of the final great creations of the Magian world of the law is Justinian's law code, the law code of Justinian, also known as the Corpus Juris, which is constructed, written by Justinian in 529 AD as its final product, which then becomes inherited by the West as a kind of Magian pseudomorphosis, something that took us a long time to get rid of and to shed in the West. So we have then that the law applies to the persona in the classical civilization. It applies to the incorporeal person who is a member of a community, the sort of subtle body, the psyche, as it were, in the Magian civilization, and to the Faustian civilization, the law applies to the will, the individual will. The classical body of law is a law of statics, applying to individual cases, individual city-states, individual bodies. There is no will of each law so that it be universally binding on into the future. There is nothing of that. In the Magian world, the law is binding on the psyche, and the individual is a member of a community, a consensus that is bound together by the spirit into an ijma or a community of some sort. And in the Faustian world, the law then applies to the will, where the individual is a sort of city-state unto himself, actually, in the Faustian world. And of course, the nation-state then is the political configuration that these laws hold together in the Faustian world. So we have three different systems of law, and he says that each one of them share nothing, literally nothing in common, even though the Faustians have inherited the Justinian law code, and it took us a while. We have the so-called Sachsenspiegel, which is put together by the Germans in 1223, and we have this problem of all of these native law codes that are tribally based in the Faustian West, the Visigothics law code, the Ostrogothic law code. All these different law codes had to be worked out, and it took a while. Mostly this was something that took place in Italy. It had to be worked out, and it took a long time for that to happen in the Faustian West. So by the time we get to Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England in 1765, we begin to see a Faustian law code that's beginning to emerge from out of the shambles of the older Justinian law code. And he says then that the task that remains ahead of us, Faustians, is then to finish off the law code, to create a jurisprudence that has finally shed the last classical pseudomorphic elements within it, and that will be fit to rank with the creation of the great Roman law codes. And so we can see that in each case we have very differing ideas, and what one culture, getting back to his initial point, enacts upon another culture in the way of influence is actually just merely superficial. Each one is trying to work out a worldview that is internally consistent with its own world. And so that's Spengler's chapter on law. Next we'll move to chapter 4, Cities and Peoples. Letter A, the soul of the city. This is actually one of my favorite chapters that we'll get to next time.